Well, I hope you guys brought your quarters with, because we're going back in time to where some arcade games got their roots. We're talking today about beat 'em ups. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Retro Recall. I'm joined with the guys again today, and we're going to discuss a time in gaming when times were a little simpler, when we just had to scroll from left to right. There wasn't any RPGs to figure out stats and all this other stuff, just beating up some dudes on the streets. Beat 'em ups is a early genre in the video game space. Traditionally, it's a simpler type of game where you just scroll from left to right. Have you guys have any experience with that? Let's maybe go around the table and.
So to me, definitely arcades. That's where I spent most of my quarters on, because I felt that you could get the most bang for your buck with your quarter on a beat 'em up. Whether it's like Final Fight or a lot of the Neo Geo beat 'em ups, Ninja Warriors. I remember that a lot, and Ninja Combat. Those are probably the more off the beaten path type games that I remember playing. But of course, the popular ones, Ninja Turtles and X-Men. You know, you have a group of kids just crowded around there, waiting their turn, putting their quarters up, just trying to beat the game. Ninja Turtles and Chuck E. Cheese, those are probably the fondest memories that I have, because that's where everybody went, because nobody really cared about at least I didn't. I didn't care about all the games where you win prizes. I just wanted to play Ninja Turtles or X-Men. To me, at the highest level, that's what I remember. Steve, what about you?
So until I became an adult and a collector, I always thought that beat 'em ups were 2D fighters and on the streets beating people up. So for the longest time, I was like, oh man, I loved all these other things too. Like you thought about, we had discussed offline here about Street Fighter. Like Street Fighter's clearly a 2D fighter, but you know, to me as a kid, I always considered that a beat 'em up. But my earliest memories are also with the arcade. I feel like a lot of kids, like you went to the movie theater, there were a lot more arcades, like a Chuck E. Cheese. We had a place called DZ Discovery Zone that was like a mega arcade. And, you know, some of the hits that everybody always was circulating around was definitely Ninja Turtles. Played the heck out of some quarters on that. Anytime we went to the movie, I was always asking for quarters from grandparents, parents, just to play a little. And Simpsons Arcade, I love that game out there. So, you know, I played that. And then if you want to talk about early console memories, I mean, as we progressed along, I played some on some other platforms, but definitely for NES was River City Ransom and Double Dragon. I played the heck out of those, and like just picking up weapons and things and beating people up. Like there's just something fun about that. When you can chuck them at somebody and it hits them in the head and they're just like, ah, and it makes some kind of cheesy sound effect. You know, there's nothing better than that. How about you, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. Good examples, guys. So my first memories of beat 'em ups are definitely in the arcade. And Rom, you already mentioned like Simpsons and Ninja Turtles and X-Men. What I always thought was so epic was the ability that you could just join in. So you see one or two guys beating up some dudes in Ninja Turtles, and you're like, oh, no one's on the Michelangelo joystick. I'm going to hop in. And you could just join mid-game, just throw a couple quarters in. And it was more of a like, you know, like, let's see if we can, you know, get to the end of this. And of course, back then they purposely made them quarter munchers, you know, and hard and difficult. So you just see that continuous screen counting down, you know, 10, 9, everyone's looking in their pockets for quarters, like hurry up, get them in there so we can keep going. And it's always like at a boss where you die. But yeah, just to take one step back. So beat 'em ups, right, are a video game genre where you're typically on like a 2D plane and moving from left to right. And usually is a co-op experience, you know, with a friend, but not always. And it gets its roots way back in the mid 1980s. Kung Fu Master was the first beat 'em up on record that was a really popular arcade game that actually saw a port to the NES. We all know it as the black box, and I've even brought my cartridge. Anyone seen this one before?
Oh yeah, good old Kung Fu.
Man.
You guys see that? Kung Fu. So that's actually where the beat 'em up genre gets its beginnings. And a couple other early ones I want to mention, just to, you know, understand the history behind it. I think it's kind of interesting. Is Renegade,
Man,
which is actually a Kunio-kun game in Japan first, but that spanned lots of different games in the same exact universe. Steve, you already mentioned Double Dragon. which Double Dragon actually has a lot of influence and is looking back for late 80s. It's very complex. I mean, you gain different move sets as you progress, and there's just some elements that are kind of interesting and make the genre a little bit more interesting, because one of the facts of the beat 'em up genre is a lot of people think it gets stale or repetitive because, I mean, by the time you're done, it's just beat guys up like hundreds by the time you're done. And I kind of get how that can get repetitive, but when you introduce some move sets, when you introduce weapons, when you introduce some teamwork, if a guy joins you mid game, I mean, I think it can stand on its own pretty well. You guys have any memories of those early games that I mentioned?
I saw, I mean, you show those off. So one of the things, like as a kid, you look at the box art, right? So you may overlook something like Kung Fu because the black box weren't very exciting. And as we discussed in our last episode about original video game art, right? Those are paper craft projects. Whereas later on, they got fancy paintings. Like just look at the art to Renegade. Can you hold that up for a second, Bill? I was always amazed by that game at the artwork, but I never thought the game stood up to the artwork. I thought it was okay, but it wasn't that great. So it's like, man, look at these guys like really brawling out, like beating all these guys up. Like I need to play this, but I think Kung Fu to me may be a better time than that. But no, I mean, almost every game you held up there, I have played or owned all those. I sold off Renegade, so I don't own that one anymore. But definitely have some early memories of those. And I loved, like you mentioned, just when you had a friend over, especially for the console games, being able to hook another controller in and just, go on a rampage together. That was so much fun at the time because that was the first real experiences I remember with friends where you could actually have two people play at the same time and not have to work in sequential order, just like Mario Brothers. Like when I was playing Mario back then, you had to wait your turn, or if you wanted to play Zelda, you had to one person at a time. But then, boom, you plug in, beat them up, and you can play two at the same time. Like River City Ransom, like we were on a rampage, like go over here, get this guy. Oh man, this guy knocked me down. Get him, get him. It's a little team camaraderie and fun.
Yeah, one thing I always found fun to do is like you take the left side of the screen, I'll take the right side of the screen, or if there's two planes, there's kind of a bottom part of the screen and a upper part of the screen. So that was kind of fun. Stuff like that, or like fighting over who got to be what character.
That's funny too. You mentioned that because I would always get frustrated, especially if somebody wasn't good at games and you're playing with them and you're like, all right, I'll get the left side. And then all the bad guys come over to the left side. What are you doing? Come over to the left side. Help me. And you're just yelling at each other.
Oh yeah. Good times for sure.
Man, I'm pretty sure I chucked a controller or two as a kid in those moments.
Oh yeah. No, there can be some rage inducing moments on these games too, even though I feel like in the scope of difficulty, beat 'em ups kind of are more towards the left side, like the easier side. But as games have gotten more complex too, I know like the modern beat 'em ups, I mean, there's a lot of depth to them, and obviously difficulty settings can play a big role. Some games nowadays, there's like 5 difficulty settings, which I always found interesting. What game setting do you guys usually pick when you do a new game difficulty? I guess I always go for just normal, just to see. I think that's what the developers kind of meant the game to be for difficulty wise.
For me, I always started it easy just to see how it is, and then if it's too easy, then I can always go up. But
Right.
A lot of times I found even normal was pretty difficult back in the day.
Yeah. Oh, especially in the NES Sega era. Street Rage 2, definitely adding more lives and putting it on easy first. But then they started being like, all right, well, you put it on easy, you're not going to get the full game until you do it. I think Street Rage 2 do that, maybe? Where you can only get to a certain point, then you had to start over, turn it to normal difficulty, then you can beat the final boss. And it's traditionally, I felt like they did that with beat 'em ups in particular.
Yeah, I think multiple genres do that, where it's kind of a tease, right? My mind goes to Ghosts and Goblins. You beat it on easier the first time around, and it's like, oh, just kidding, you got to go through this whole game again. But no, there's definitely cases where on easy mode you don't see the true ending or even the final stages. But yeah, that's an interesting fact that they bake those into the games.
And I'm about to unlock a core memory for somebody out there. You have it on normal or the game's very difficult. You just died and the continue screen's up and you're like, damn it. And you rip the cord and then the whole console comes flying out, and then it freezes, and you're like, no, I can't hit the continue button. I just lost it on the fourth stage, so I've almost made it to the last stage. I've done that a few times. I don't know about you guys, but beat 'em ups are one of those genres that would do it to you.
Yeah, I feel like you get pretty animated with beat 'em ups, meaning your arms are flailing around, or you're like trying to mash the buttons as quick as you can, or like if my kids play with me, they're at that age where we sit down and I'm like, okay, remember there's a cord on this controller. We can't get too crazy.
Right.
Yeah, some definite some moments of anxiety of my NES flying on the floor or something, but fortunately they made those things like tanks. So
modern technology with wireless controllers, just spend the money, wireless everything. Because you're right, I trip over them still, but yeah, having kids, they don't realize like it doesn't compute like, oh, there's a wire going from here to here, because they grew up. Our kids are similar age. They grew up with the PS4 controller, walking around the house with it. So
I'm pretty sure I almost killed my mom at least 3 times from the cord, yanking it around and she's walking by.
Definitely.
Yep. Oh man. So yeah, back to beat 'em ups for a minute here. So can you guys think of, Steve, you mentioned some memories on consoles. So Rom, you actually mentioned my favorite game, maybe my favorite game on the whole entire Sega Genesis, which is a bold statement because I'm a big Sega guy. But Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2, man, those games, like, if you haven't gotten into beat 'em ups, if there's any listeners out there that, most people have played beat 'em ups, but if you find yourself thinking beat 'em ups are just too easy or repetitive or not very fun, you need to go play Streets of Rage 2 specifically. That's kind of where Sega really got it right, really got it polished. And some tropes, some common things with beat 'em ups, besides fighting in the streets, is the music. The music is usually, it has to be catchy, right? I mean, if you're doing a repetitive type game of the same gameplay over and over, you got to have something to hook you. And man, the music in Streets of Rage, or even some of these other IPs, Final Fight on Super Nintendo, or even the Turtles games, all fantastic music. The Turtles 2 arcade games specifically for NES, that music is burned into my brain so hard, it's ridiculous and instantly recognizable, which I think is really cool, unique part of this genre that not every genre has necessarily. Some of these soundtracks, Streets of Rage 2, you can listen to on its own. You don't even need to be playing a game. You can just pop it in and listen to it. Or, fortunately on the internet these days, we can just pull up any soundtrack. It's really cool. But any ones that strike a memory for you guys of, the music or specific bosses or games you want to bring up again? I think there's lots of memories way back there for us.
I think that's a great point. And I think you mentioned to me before, like the Streets of Rage, the guy that did the soundtrack to it. I know you're a big soundtrack guy. Didn't he used to play clubs with the music from that? Like that's how kicking that soundtrack was.
Still does. Yuzo Koshiro. Yep. He's a remarkable composer who he can do a wide variety of music. At the time in the early 90s, Streets of Rage 2 dropped in 1992. He had a lot of influence from like EDM music, dance music, some Euro, stuff that was coming out of Europe, some Euro step, I guess they call it. There's so many different subgenres of electronic music, some house, techno even, So, it's definitely, a sign of the times, but it just holds up. It's just amazing 30 some years later that it's still that catchy, and it's just really complex, and it's not, there's a different track for each stage. I know a lot of earlier games, they just had looping soundtracks where it's just the same, there might be 3 or 4 tracks that loop the entire game. Where you get a beat 'em up like Streets of Rage, there's like 8 stages and they're a different unique track that are 3-4 minutes each. So it's kind of cool that they went through that much time and effort to make sure that the music flows and gets you through that whole game.
Yeah. It's always cool to hear about that. And I know today they make a lot of these old soundtracks too. They even press them on vinyl for the collectors. nice additions.
Yeah, I've got multiple.
There's a lot of beat 'em up soundtracks. And then back to your question. Now that I got off track a little there, like Streets of Rage, that's one of the ones I really remember a lot. And with beat 'em ups, it was all action paced too. So it was like more action, more weapons, more things you can do. And that's one series that really, to me, like kind of grew as it went along. And you hit 2 and you hit this like pinnacle. It was like the perfect balance of everything. And then he went to number 3, and Streets of Rage 3 is a great game. But I feel like number 2 was better than number 3 because they got too cute with it. They maybe pushed it a little too far. So it's still an excellent game. Don't get me wrong. I love the full series, but Streets of Rage 2 is all the way. And you can look at a lot of beat 'em up series because if they were good, they got a lot of different games that came out during that era. I mean, just look at the Final Fight series. There's quite a few of those. I mean, even you got like Mighty Final Fight, which is a whole different, concept, but in the series. So, I remember a lot of those different ones. Ninja Turtles, especially too. Like that would just grab you in between the action and the soundtrack. It's action in your face all the time.
Oh, definitely. And just to nerd out for a second on Streets of Rage 1, 2, and 3. So Streets of Rage 1 is still a good game. There's definitely some polish that's not there. But, and 2 is obviously regarded as the best. 3, one interesting fact about 3 that makes it, not everyone's favorite is, first and foremost, the Japanese version isn't quite as difficult. For whatever reason, when they brought it over to the US, they decided they want to crank up the difficulty. So Bare Knuckle 3, as it's known in Japan, is definitely the version to play if you're a new player out there and just are looking for a new experience. And of course, too, also the Streets of Rage 3 gets kind of a bad rap for the soundtrack because it's very experimental. And Yuzo Koshiro was just, he's very experienced at that point. He was just kind of looking for a different direction and trying some new stuff. And the soundtrack is pretty jarring if you're not like really well versed in the techno type scene. And so that's kind of why that one gets a bad rap. But it's definitely, it was definitely a Sega versus Nintendo battle going on with Final Fight and Streets of Rage. And just one simple fact that I always like to dog on the Super Nintendo folks is Final Fight, the Super Nintendo port, which was an arcade game first. But when they ported it to the Super Nintendo, for whatever reason, they lacked having the 2-player co-op, which I think is like a really big misstep for Capcom back in the early 90s. It's like, to recognize that that's a core gameplay mechanic with a beat 'em up. And so Sega's sitting back like, just ready to pounce on that. And I think they really nailed it with Streets of Rage 2 as their answer to Final Fight. Because Final Fight, I believe, was first. So it's definitely interesting. Like, I think it's a pivotal point in the console wars back during the 16-bit days. And I definitely think, I'm obviously Team Sega at this point on the 16-bit thing, but it was definitely a big knockout, I think.
Well, not to mention that they took out the most interesting character in Final Fight when they ported it to SNES. Guy was my favorite character. Yeah,
that's right. I forgot.
When I was like, wait a minute, I could just play as Cody and Hagar, and probably was a memory thing back then. But yeah, I was a little bummed about that. And kind of on my end, we were talking about just different stuff. Like I was more of an arcade person. Like I played, Streets of Rage, but that was in an arcade. A Sega game like Golden Axe was kind of like my first intro, and I tend to go toward the fantasy type of stuff, with the exception of one beat 'em up that I was like kind of researching and stuff. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was amazing. I mean, you're talking about music. I mean, come on. I mean, yeah, Michael Jackson.
That was awesome.
Yeah, you get in a freaking mech, and I mean, it's just completely bonkers, and just smooth criminal soundtrack. It was
the signature of Michael Jackson crotch grabs.
It has everything.
I mean, everything in that game is over the top, ridiculous. You're saving small children.
Yep.
In hindsight now, it sounds a little weird.
And the monkey. I mean,
back in the day, it was like, yeah, let's go save these kids. Michael Mega Mike, and when you turn into Mecha Mike, it's like nothing can stop you once you become a robot, Michael Jackson.
And then you make everybody dance. I mean,
Yeah, at the end when you win,
it's amazing.
And the collector side of it's interesting too, because you not only have there's some that have Thriller in there and some that don't. So there's people that go after the carts that have Thriller in there. So there's like, if you have that, I forget which stage it is or whatever, and they removed it for some reason and later on. So there's a collector's item there. And there's also a fairly well-known, I mean, not everybody knows about it. I guess this is kind of getting into a niche, but on occasion on the Sega Genesis games, they messed up in the factory where the labels got put on upside down.
I've seen
I've seen the Moonwalker ones pop up a number of times where they have the upside down logo. So that's one of the common factory mishaps that you'll see on Sega Genesis. It's not a bootleg if you see an upside down label. It's more likely that it actually came that way from the factory. They messed up a whole batch before they realized, and they made it out.
They're just like, yeah, just send them. I was kind of going down, like, for me in the arcade, like Alien versus Predator, great arcade beat 'em up. And then the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, the Shadows over Mystaria and the Tower of Doom, I believe. Those were amazing because we were talking about how, okay, what do you do? It's just, you're just doing the same thing over and over again. Well, you level up in here, you get different spells, you get a lot of things that kind of like keep the game fresh. And that was kind of toward the end of the arcade lifespan. That came out, Alien vs. Predator came out in 96 or something like that. So it didn't get that much playtime until arcades kind of just went by way of the dodo, you know. Definitely like those type of games are what I remember. Maybe I stayed in arcades a little longer than most people did. It was just fun to kind of get out and do that. But anyway, go ahead, Steve.
No, I was curious because we were talking about this before. So before we started this episode, and Bill, you had mentioned to me like Final Fight for Streets of Rage. For me as a kid, I had all friends that had Streets of Rage. I had nobody that had Final Fight. So for me, I don't even remember playing in the arcade as a kid. So I was never super exposed to it. Whereas I know it's a cult following, but I was just kind of curious to see like, hey, what was the sales numbers? Because when I became a collector, I was like, wow, Final Fight games are expensive. I was like, are they rare? Are they just popular? Like, what was it? So I did a little quick search here. So the Final Fight series as a whole sold 3.2 million units for all games. Streets of Rage 2, just by itself, Streets of Rage 2 by itself sold 3.64 million copies.
So that's without, because it was a pack-in, right? And you
that would probably count in the numbers.
Okay. Not saying, I mean, you guys know I'm more of a Nintendo, Super Nintendo guy. You know, I went to a friend's house to play Sega, and it was fun. But yeah, you had that advantage of it being you know, I wouldn't have even known about it if it didn't come with Sega, right? So with the Genesis.
And that's just the Sega Genesis Streets of Rage 2. Right. There was also one on Game Gear. You had Streets of Rage 3. I know it's sold pretty well. I don't think it sold as well because it's a little harder to find out there. But Streets of Rage 1, there's a ton of copies out there. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if the full series sold over 10 million copies between all platforms like Game Gear and all that. That's probably why I didn't see it. I mean, I didn't have as many friends. We were kind of a Sega area, but it's always interesting to find new ones, especially Mighty Final Fight. I do like that game. That's a fun one.
Yeah, Mighty Final Fight's a strange one. How they, you know, that's a late NES title and very collectible. We're talking a couple $100 for a loose cart.
Yep.
But it's like, you know, 1993, whatever, 94. They're like, let's bring in Final Fight to NES on 8-bit. It just seemed like an interesting choice.
Just make it chibi. And I'm curious what came first, if they like did the experiment with Splatterhouse in Japan. And they're like, hey, this seemed to do okay. What else can we do that too? I feel like y'all would probably know more about the Splatterhouse, or like that stuff like for the NES, because
I think late in the NES life, you know, we had Double Dragon, we had River City Ransom, we had a couple other games. Yeah. You know, there was multiple Double Dragons that came out. I think they were starting to get the beat 'em up formula down really good, because there were some that were kind of not so good, and then there were some that were really like stood out to you.
Right.
So by the time Mighty Final Fight came around, they really started getting the genre in an excellent place. And it came out late, so it didn't sell as good. So of course nowadays, like, okay, you got a good title, it's Capcom, it's got great box art on it, it's got, great gameplay, all the things you want for an expensive game.
For sure.
Capcom had a number of those that were really expensive too. I know you know that, Bill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the late Capcom releases, like 92, 93, 94, command some serious dollars if you're in the collecting game.
I'm glad I finished that up. I mean, it's crazy to think like how much it's changed over it's been a year and a half, 2 years when I had all the Capcom, and now it's just kind of like I feel bad for you, Bill, because there's a couple that are going to be a little harder to attain. But you got your Mighty Final Fight, so that's probably the better of the ones that you got. So.
And a lot of these games, like even like you look at Game Gear or Game Boy, like they did ports to them. I found like a lot of the Game Boy beat 'em ups, and I'm sure there's some gems I'm not thinking of the top of my head, but when they tried to port a lot of those games over, they just were kind of sluggish on the Game Boy. Whereas I felt like at least the ones that I played on the Game Gear were pretty good. Like the Streets of Rage port to Game Gear is a really fun game. My buddy had that, and we just played it all the time. We would switch back and forth playing. We had a blast. I think he had Streets of Rage 2 for it. So they did do an excellent job on the Game Gear if you want to check out some portable beat 'em ups. And it blows my mind to this day too that we're getting some resurgences in some of these things. Like the River City series, they brought that back. They did a number of them on the 3DS, and they're pretty good. They also did the River City Girls one that the limited run did the physical release of that. That's a great game too. We just got Streets of Rage 4. They're going to build another Streets of Rage. I saw when I pulled up the sales chart numbers, it looked like Streets of Rage 4 did 3 million in sales. So, I mean, that's not bad for a game that was dead for 20 plus years.
Yeah, Streets of Rage 4 is excellent. Like, it's really good. And there's a lot of depth to it, a lot of characters. Typically back in the day, it'd be 3 or 4 characters at most. I mean, I think there's like 8, and you can level up some stats. You get stronger, you get different move sets, you get, and obviously some quality of life changes being modern, save states and stuff, and different, abilities to hop in and out, to play online. All those things are definitely present on the new ones.
So you're kind of moving into that upper echelon, talking about Switch and stuff. Man, there's so many good beat 'em ups that are on newer gen consoles too. Like if you've ever played Muramasa, which came out on the Wii, and then you've got stuff like Dragon's Crown or Code of Princess that are really like, it's got that whole hand-drawn art style. Definitely something worth checking out because they just look amazing, especially in HD, which I know it's more retro, but like, that genre is still kind of moving forward. They just released the new Ninja Turtles and stuff. So there's some stuff out there that you don't have to go out and get a retro game console or whatever. You can pick stuff up on modern systems too.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really actually excited, and happy to see that the genre is being resurrected a bit, because I feel like it still gets a bad rap of it being repetitive and like an older style, like from the 90s or, quarter muncher type. It's definitely designed as a quarter muncher, right? I mean, we're going to make it difficult and but yet it's addicting gameplay. So you want to keep going and progress, where I'm glad they were able to kind of, get with times and kind of, bring it into the modern age too. Definitely. I'm really happy to see that for sure. If you guys want, I'd like to go around the table again here and just, for those listeners out there that are maybe, getting a little bit newer into the collecting side of things, or wanting to play some classic beat 'em ups, from the earlier consoles, I just wanted to give a few recommendations of, easily accessible, affordable titles that are out there, just so some folks have some chance to look some of these games up and, maybe check them out for the first time if they've never checked them out. I guess I just have some games written down from NES, from Genesis, from Super Nintendo, and we can kind of share these as we go. But just a couple on the NES, because that's kind of where I started with game collecting and game playing back in the day. Steve, you mentioned Double Dragon several times. there is a trilogy. It's, Double Dragon 1, 2, and 3 on the NES. I think with a lot of games, 2 is peak, so I would recommend Double Dragon 2. It's a great co-op experience. It's a really good game to sit down with a friend and try to beat to the end, even today. And it presents a challenge. It's got great gameplay. River City Ransom, you had already mentioned, Steve. That's obviously a great one to sit down with a friend. Just one word of caution with River City Ransom is watch out for the password system. Fortunately, nowadays we have smartphones and we can just take a snapshot of the screen, or you can look it up online or something. But man, do you guys know what I'm talking about with the password system on that game?
Yep. Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
It is wild. It is probably the worst one out there as far as like it's a giant paragraph of symbols and letters and numbers. It's pretty interesting if you guys want to look that up someday. And then just going on with a couple other NES titles that I think are must-haves, must-owns at this point is Turtles, Ninja Turtles, obviously, but the arcade game and 3, the Manhattan Project. Those are the 2 beat 'em ups. There was, the original 1989 2D side scroller or action platformer. That's, not in the beat 'em up category, but number 2, the arcade game, and number 3, Manhattan Project, are both excellent picks. Still fun to this day, in my opinion. Very pick up and play, very accessible, and very affordable.
That's where that's kind of where the Ninja Turtles, for those that are Ninja Turtles fans, that's when it kind of took a shift. So there's a lot of bad rap on the original NES first Ninja Turtles, and it's definitely a lot different. When I was a kid, I rented that and I was like, wow, this, it does feel like a Ninja Turtles and going down in the sewer. It just was confusing to me. I didn't feel like it was a bad game. I just didn't know what to do and some of those difficulty things. But then Ninja Turtles 2 came along, and I think that's the one that probably, if you were a kid and you played a Ninja Turtle game on NES, that's the one you probably did. Because I don't even remember the third one back in the day. Did any of you guys actually play it? It's a great game now. It's definitely one I'd recommend. It's a great one on your list there. I never played it back in the day. It was all number 2.
Arcade. It was a late release, like 92, 93, somewhere in there. And, it was definitely like more big time fans, and I was a big time Turtles fan, still am. So I played it back then too, but it's a little more hard to come by, and you don't see it as often. It's not as popular. So if you've played all these already, there's a new one to seek out that you may have not played yet. Okay, not to put you guys on the spot, but Rom, I'm going to head down to you. You got some Super Nintendo picks that you want to share?
Oh yeah, most definitely. And we can talk about the mainstream type stuff like Ninja Turtles, of course. Those, I mean, any of those are good, and the Final Fights. But like kind of the lesser known one, like Rival Turf and Brawl Brothers, those came out kind of like at the launch. They weren't great, but they're beat 'em up, and actually those you can get on the Nintendo Switch. Like if you're part of the Nintendo Online stuff, those are included, and those are pretty fun. Just go through them, beat them, and you're good type games. And of course, you got your Battletoads and Double Dragon, which was for some reason super frustrating for me. I was terrible. Basically, anything Battletoads on it, for some reason I just automatically am bad. But it's a very good fighting game, and some of the stuff you don't even think of, like there's Marvel stuff too. I wanted to go in on the arcade side of things because you got Captain America and Avengers, which is actually on Super Nintendo as well. Those are really good. There's Alien versus Predator. They ported the arcade over there, the arcade game over there. And then...
can I jump in? I got a couple more for you.
Yeah.
Knights of the Round, I think, is a really good pick.
Amazing game.
That's the one that came to mind for me too.
So I think that one's a bit pricier if you're looking to collect physical cartridges, but that one's definitely got some more depth to it, and it's more of that fantasy type theme that you were talking about, Rom. Exactly. And then King of Dragons is also similar, with the medieval type theme.
I never played that. So is it like the Knights of the Round?
Man.
Or?
Yeah, you need to play that.
Okay, yeah, I've seen it, but I always thought it was more of like an RPG. Like Draken or something like that.
It's definitely got some RPG elements. Sometimes we use that phrase. But there's different. You got your sword character, you got your range attack bow archer character. you got all the tropes for sure, but it's I mean it's a beat 'em up for
Okay.
sure. It's not an RPG.
There's a lot of crossover as the beat 'em up genre kind of progressed. You'll find platforming elements and other things just to mix up the gameplay, which I also think keeps some of these games fresh or adds another element.
Right.
Yep. And then one more I'm going to add that's also in the fantasy realm is Magic Sword, which that one's got some multiple genres in it as well.
See, this makes me goes to our discussion that y'all beat me up on about what we had about 30 minutes ago.
I get it. That one kind of is questionable in what genre it fits in. I get it for sure.
Well, but see, by y'all's definition, and we won't get into. I mean, unless we want to get into it, by definition, it's a beat 'em up. But I always kind of saw that as more of a side scroller co-op. But it's a fine line. But it's a great game. I love playing that in the arcade. To me, like it's funny how sounds kind of trigger you in certain ways, like hearing X-Men or Ninja Turtles in the arcade. But when you pick up gems in Magic Sword, I can pick that out in the arcade. I'm like, they have Magic Sword in here because it's so distinctive. That's on a tangent, but
No, it's a great tangent because a lot of these games have so distinct, not only music but the sound effects, like or even something silly like Altered Beast, Steve. The rise from your grave. Like it takes you back. Like it. Yeah, it's Golden Axe too. The sound effects in Golden Axe, like somewhat cheesy, but the sounds like the short dwarf character makes, like when you're knocking him in the head with that axe and stuff. I mean, it's just so classic. And then when you're
at the campfire, just the music and then the sound of you beating up the little guys to get the loot.
Yeah,
and some people don't like the games because they find it like Golden Axe, like because of the cheesiness. But
no, that's what makes it great.
It's got such a charm. I mean, it's so great to go back and revisit and just have a good laugh at. Same thing with Altered Beast. I mean, it's just power up. It's just there's so many little things that just
when the beast grows and the thing.
Yeah, you hear that, you're like, uh-oh, something's going down. Like,
yeah, it's amazing. Let's pass it over to Steve. Steve, you got some Sega Genesis recommendations that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I mean they're not all cheap, so prepare your wallets. Right. But definitely, I mean my number one beat 'em up on Sega Genesis is definitely Hyperstone Heist. You mentioned being a big Ninja Turtles fan. I mean, I remember my mom hand stitched a costume for me. I was Raphael all the way. He was my favorite. I had my little whatever you call those fork things. They reminded me of like, going to dinner, but like a little more dangerous. Streets of Rage was definitely up there for me. They're not super cheap, but if you want to have a cart only game where it gets expensive, as they had the Sega Classics versions of those, kind of like the greatest hits you saw with PlayStation. They're a bit cheaper, but if you want the original prints, they have the nice full size box art, which those were beautiful box arts. I mean, they covered every inch of that cover on the original releases with the art by Mick McGinty, and those are a little more pricey. I mean, you may be spending $60-$80. Streets of Rage 3 is pretty expensive if you want that. It's like I want to say it's like 100 plus on CIB. A couple others. I mean, you already mentioned Golden Axe is definitely one people talk a lot about. Golden Axe 2 is probably the favorite of folks out there. You got a couple Double Dragon games. Not all of them were great. Maybe Double Dragon's probably one of the better ones out of the lot. The Splatterhouse series, I really enjoy those. And we were talking about this also beforehand. There are some platforming elements to it, but really you're just beating people up the whole time. So to me, that's a pure beat 'em up with a couple little like avoid the obstacle kind of platforming things. It's still a side scroller and a lot of fun graphics. There's a lot of fun action, keeps you on your toes. A lot of variety of enemies, and if you like kind of that more horror elements, it's fun too. Back in the day, it was probably considered pretty violent and gory. Now it's just kind of cheesy to me, the violence. But Maximum Carnage is another one. I don't know. I don't know if we mentioned that one yet.
No.
I actually like that game. You can play it on Super Nintendo as well. It gets a bad rap sometimes. There's a number of Marvel beat 'em up type games, but like I feel like every Marvel game has some kind of beat 'em up elements to it for like things like X-Men or whatever. But if they're not a traditional beat 'em up, that particular title, like for instance, Batman on Sega Genesis, like there are some beat 'em up like type elements to it, but it's really an action platformer. It's platforming first. You have some action items, not action items. You have some actions you can do, but it's mostly a platformer. So like that's an example of like when Marvel took it more platforming, and then on other ones they'll take it more beat 'em up. So you can check it out game by game.
Batman seems to be, it kind of jumped all over the place because you'd have like Batman Returns, for example. On some releases, it was a platformer, like you said, and then like Super Nintendo, Batman Returns is a beat 'em up, right?
Yeah, you did have some cross. So sometimes there was different publishers or different groups making it. So you may see some variety across the platforms as well. Like in that instance, a couple others. I mean, you mentioned Battletoads. Battletoads got a lot of ports. To me, that's always been a beat 'em up, but it has so many different genres in the game. I could see anybody arguing that it's something else, but when that giant foot comes out and hits somebody in the face, it's like, yeah, you're beating the heck out of them. The Punisher, that's another one. You may see that's an okay game. Alien Storm, definitely one that doesn't get talked as much about, but is a good one. And one of my personal favorites, Power Rangers the movie. I love that game. Just beating up all the ooze and the baddies and that. A lot of fun. You can go through that, crush through it in the end. You just feel good about your day at the end of it. Yeah, just a couple to check out.
Okay, so one more that's exclusive to the Sega Genesis that I think is a very, very good game is Comics Zone. You guys ever played that?
Yeah, I like Comic Zone.
I just thought it was very unique with the hop in between the drawings, comic book style. He hops between all the, and like I just think it's a great one. The sound effects are they have a lot of punch to them, if that makes sense. It's kind of a funny way to put it, but being a beat 'em up, but it's definitely something unique to check out. That's very Sega, like it just screams Sega when you're playing it.
It was very difficult. I don't think I ever beat it.
Yeah, I guess that's pretty good grouping of games there. I think there's, like over a dozen we've mentioned that people can check out. We didn't even touch on, the 32-bit generation, like PS1, Sega Saturn. There was still some 2D stuff out there. And we didn't even really touch on 3D beat 'em ups. I think of when Die Hard Arcade kind of hit the scenes, and we could go on, about some 3D stuff too. But I think this is more of a 2D, focused genre and episode, which is fine. Yeah, have you guys played? I'm sure you guys have played the Die Hard ones. I think we mentioned it in a previous episode of how ramped up that one. The volume was always loud and the sound effects were just over the top, and it's a really cool take on an arcade game.
The quick time events we talked about. Yeah, so if you want to know our thoughts on whether Die Hard's a Christmas game, go check out the Christmas episode, Home Alone Christmas.
Absolutely.
That's my favorite. Like if you talk about 3D, there's one that stands out. It's Die Hard Arcade, and I just love the heck out of that game. 3D or not, if you've never played that game, go play it if you want to check out beat 'em ups that are, kind of towards the modern era.
Yeah, I can't. So you got the Die Hard Arcade. Were there any other Saturn type beat 'em ups that came out like around that era? The only other thing that comes to mind close to that is like Fighting Force, which was difficult because they didn't get that whole 3D aspect very well. But
I don't think there's any 3D ones per se. There's that really good 2D one on Saturn that's got some RPG
Guardian
elements.
Heroes.
Yeah,
Guardian Heroes was really good. Yeah, and that's where you're kind of getting into the hand drawn type stuff.
Dynamite Cop
was one of them.
That's Dreamcast. Yeah.
Yeah, it's moving a little further forward, but
it's still kind of the same thing because then you could jump into Power Stone, things like that, which it's still retro, but it's not co-op. Power Stone is just like, hey, beat the crap out of your friends,
Another point, Rom, too, for Saturn is the Dungeons and Dragons games. I think there's a couple beat 'em ups, I believe, that are more, similar to that Knights of the Round or King of Dragons type. There's some RPG elements in there, but
yeah, we mentioned the Shadows of Mysteria and the Tower of Doom. Yeah, those are
you
really
covered
good.
them. Yeah.
Plays a cleric, a wizard, and the wizard actually sits back and fires magic missile and stuff. And yeah, that was toward the end of the arcade lifespan, but still great beat 'em ups.
No, I kind of think like one of the things with the beat 'em up genre, it kind of shifted a little bit as we went to the modern era. You didn't see as much of those classic beat 'em ups, but one genre that to me that really has roots in beat 'em ups is those like and it's popular over in Japan where they just throw a million different, soldiers out there in the battlefield and you got to kill all the soldiers and you have a team and they're dispatched. Are they called Warriors
Yeah,
games or I forget what
Dynasty
the
Warriors.
genre is referred to? Yeah, like Dynasty
Hmm.
Warriors was one of the ones, but there's like a term for that genre. But all you do is just beat them up, and if you're I'm just mashing buttons when I play those games, and it's like combo 35. Like that's all the stuff you used to see on like the arcade beat 'em ups and things. So I think that to me that kind of classifies as a modern beat 'em up. They have all different but moves and
Yeah,
things.
there's a few different genres that kind of find their roots in beat 'em ups. That being one of them, for sure.
That and like the Tales of Destiny series, like the the that was the intro of the action RPG basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think like hack and slash too maybe kind of gets its
Hmm.
roots in beat 'em ups. Like 3D beat 'em ups kind of evolved into hack and slash games. Rom, I know you kind of revisiting the Lord of the Rings games on PS2 even. I think that genre is definitely the hack and slash. Kind of finds its roots from beat 'em ups. That's just the repetitive constant waves of enemies. Yeah, you have a sword or arrows or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
definitely like you get some combos. It's very arcadey kind of. Yeah,
Hmm.
you can definitely see the roots there for sure. I think that's kind of an interesting take. One more part of beat 'em ups I wanted to mention, guys, before we close this episode out is, what part of beat 'em ups, like what takes a game to the top of the list. I feel like we've mentioned so many games. There's numerous games we didn't even mention. It's a genre that's got a lot of options out there. What elements makes it a top tier game? A couple things that came to mind was the weapons. If it's just the generic, one bat or one chain, that's going to get stale. If you got lots of different choices for weapons, that sets it apart. The chance to use a little bit more complex inputs. I'm thinking type Street Fighter type inputs. I know Streets of Rage 2 has a few different options of combos that you can input, so it's not just mashing the punch or the kick button. That's another thing that's really unique that kind of sets games apart. And then also, like some collectibles or some just some other things that are thrown in there, some environmental hazards. There might be some spots where you have to avoid some pits or avoid some environmental hazards where it might trip you up or different things like that, just to keep things fresh. Do you guys have any other thoughts on that of what sets one apart?
One of the things I think that makes a big difference between whether it's an enjoyable experience or not is kind of the hit detection. Because you may be scrolling on some games where you're just fixed on that 2D plane, but a lot of that error of beat 'em ups, you could also go vertically just a little bit up or down. And if the hit detection is not very good, you could be like, it looks like you're right on top of them, but you're just below them a little bit, and it's hard to hit them. Or maybe the enemies have really good hit detection; they hit you really easy, and you can't get them easy. That'll frustrate you pretty quickly. I also think that some of the animations makes a difference. So, like Streets of Rage had a lot of flashy stuff, and if you feel like when you hit somebody or knock them down, like you really accomplish something, like the animation's cool, that really makes it, that next level of a beat 'em up. Knock a guy just falling over isn't as exciting as a guy like, ugh, like a funny sound effect and like he falls on the ground kind of thing. Or maybe the weapon explodes or whatever when you chuck it at him. Like those little elements make a big difference. And of course, when you tie the full soundtrack together, there's all those elements. I know a lot of games had like flashing arrows, like go this way. So like they were pretty straightforward, or you knew where to go. If it's pretty easy to tell like what you got to do at the end. Sometimes you get to the end of a level and like it's not advancing. You're like, why is it not advancing? And you got to scroll to the left, and you realize, oh, I missed a bad guy all the way over here. So if there's not too much of that, where you're kind of like lost, where it's pretty straightforward. It's not meant to be a lot of thinking in a beat 'em up. I do like some of the additional elements that get mixed in sometimes. Like they had a little bit of platforming, like Battletoads. Battletoads definitely had a lot of platforming and different stuff. Like even like the mix up there was drop down the big tunnel in the one level where you're like swinging, but then you're still just beating people up, but you're swinging side to side and getting the guys on the sides. And I do remember the item that I forgot about here a little bit ago that I wanted to mention. It's definitely a game that you wouldn't think of as a beat 'em up. But one of the reasons I think this is a great game is because they worked in beat 'em up elements to it, even though it's not beat 'em up first, and that's Road Rash. If anybody played that game, you definitely remember punching the guys off of their bikes, and that was the most fun thing about that game to me. I love that series, and if they didn't put that in there, true beat 'em up style, it would not be the game that it was, in my opinion. So, you can get non beat 'em up games too that, bring in some of the fun of the beat 'em up genre. How about you, Rom? Any other things you think that make a good beat 'em up?
To me, I just like different characters kind of having their own attributes, and started doing that with like Streets of Rage and things like that. You're like, okay, this person's definitely a little faster, but they don't hit as hard, but you can maneuver a lot better. To me, that kind of like has a sense of uniqueness when it comes to that, and that's why I loved like the fantasy type stuff, because you had the Dungeons and Dragons, and it's a legit different way of playing the character, and just having different abilities. Like, hey, I could sit back and throw my magic missile once again, versus the fighter that's just in your face. And I liked how it kind of just started separating different play styles. At the beginning of stuff, it was just kind of like, okay, this guy, he's a little bulkier, but and he has a different special move. But other than that, there's no change to really the fighting game. Because I mean, as you get older, I think you're kind of like, all right, let's try to change it up and spice it up a little bit, and that's what I enjoy, just having more variety of how you play.
Yeah, good points, Rom. One thing I was going to mention earlier as well, too, that these games that I find that's really cool about this genre is that they're easy to pick up and play, but difficult to master. So that's kind of a cool aspect to it. Anybody can pick up and play beat 'em up, but to go through Streets of Rage 2 on expert mode, you got to have some skills. It's not luck and button mashing. There is some strategy to it. I think of, simple things like if you hit up and C while you're being thrown, you'll land on your feet instead of getting knocked down. Where beginner players will just be, oh, I got knocked down, and they're just mashing. Things like that, when to use your special attack because it takes a little bit of life off of your life bar. Things like that. Some complexity built in. I just thought of something that would be kind of a fun exercise to kind of close this out here, guys. So kind of like a lightning round, if you will. I want your guys' picks for one of your favorites and what character you're going with. And I can start us out to give you guys a second to think. I'm going Streets of Rage 2 because it's just classic, and I'm going with Blaze. Everyone seems to pick Axel right off the bat, or even the, Max, the big wrestler, the slower moving character, like you mentioned, Rom. But I think Blaze is the best character, and her move sets are just ridiculous. And if you master the spin kick, you're getting a long ways into that game.
Not to mention maneuverability, like just you're able to get around and a lot easier.
Yeah, definitely.
They're not as bulky.
So what do you guys got? Who's going first? Give me the one of your favorite games and which character you're picking.
Probably the most recent beat 'em up game I've beat, which I played on my second Nomad after I fixed it up, was Hyperstone Heist. And despite my love for Raphael and the roots of my childhood with him, Donatello, I loved him with the staff. So that staff, I'd go over there and boom. Like, I don't know, something about having a big weapon kind of is fun to me in a beat 'em up.
Yeah, his reach is definitely, something that's advantageous for sure. So one little fun fact I'm going to interject about the Turtles 16-bit beat 'em ups, Turtles in Time and Hyperstone Heist. Steve, I'm sure you know this. Raphael specifically has the least amount of health, but hits the hardest. So there's, you can look up these stats online or back in Nintendo Power back in the day too. But it's very interesting. Like if you look at the life bar, Raphael's is super low, but if you look how he hits like a truck. In Hyperstone Heist, there's a rhythm that you can get where you hit an enemy, and then if you time it right, he'll grab the enemy and then swing him back and forth, and then you're hitting multiple guys. If you get in that rhythm, it only takes one swing to take out guys, where Donatello or Leo will take multiple. And it's something kind of interesting that you don't really realize right away that they built into the game. Some thought was put into attributes of health and how hard they hit. So, but I'm with you, man. I would go Donatello every time. He's kind of my favorite.
I forgot about that too. Yeah, a lot of times when you select on a screen, and if you don't know, like as you play it, you figure out like, hey, this character is better at this, or vice versa. But that definitely was an element. I never like to take the character with the least amount of health, just because I'm like, what am I getting into here? I'll probably die like 8 times the first time. So maybe that's part of why I veer towards Donatello. But something about having a bigger weapon just in better reach just seemed like, hey, and I think he picks up the characters with the staff and then does that with them too, if I remember right. It's been a little bit since I played the game, but yeah, definitely Hyperstone Heist for me.
Nice. Ron, what do you got?
I was going to say Turtles in Time, Donatello, but now I'm changing it up.
Sorry.
Someone beat me to the punch. But
it's a different game.
Besides that, Simpsons, Lisa, the jump rope. The jump rope has that. Honestly, Lisa and Marge had the biggest reach. And that to me, and I'm playing a beat 'em up, is the further you can get me away from the person, but I can still hit him. That's how you do it, because wasting quarters, and you don't want to get hit, so you want to be able to hit him from a little bit of a distance. So definitely Lisa.
Do you guys remember? Did Homer have a weapon? I know Bart had Bart.
No, he punched.
Bart had the skateboard. Marge had the vacuum, right?
Yep. Vacuum, and Lisa had jump rope, and Homer just fisticuffs.
Man.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I wasn't thinking arcade. I was just thinking consoles for a minute here. But if we're talking my all-time favorite beat 'em up, it may just be nostalgia too, but Simpsons Arcade, and I used to play Bart in that game, so that's an excellent choice.
Everybody played Bart. It was a fight. Everybody wanted that third position right there.
Yeah, I think if we're going arcade, back to arcades to close out here for favorites, I'm going to go with X-Men. And have you guys ever seen the 6-player cabinet? It is just ridiculous how big that thing is. Man. It's crazy. And one thing that sticks out in my mind that I'll never forget is that roar sound that Colossus makes. So nostalgic.
That's his.
I'm not going to try to mimic it right now because it'll sound ridiculous over the airwaves.
Come on, give it to us, Bill. Don't tease us like that.
Yeah, ready? Just kind of.
That's
Love
pretty
it.
good. That's pretty good.
I don't know. It's just so nostalgic to me, just hearing that. And I swear you could hear that machine from 100 feet away, just calling you, like that giant thing with all those joysticks. I don't know. So that's where I go towards for favorite memories of arcades.
Dude, I forgot about that. Like, there were so many arcade machines set on loud, and they would just yell at you.
So there it is. See, I did it.
There you go.
I did okay.
Bill, you were pretty close there. I thought there were two of you for a minute there.
You got to add that to the beginning of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us this week, everybody. And stay tuned. We're bringing another episode here in a couple weeks about collecting.